Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, Navigating the New Normal, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and the economy, real estate and medicine, technology and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plow. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 national American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission and this free public affairs program with a donation of any amount. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center online and donate at afrmc.org. Join us on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. We depend on our audience's support to help the hospital in Israel. So thank you if you can contribute any amount. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. Today's Global Connections topic is America's immigration debate. Thank you to our very special guest, Doris Meissner, Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute, Dr. Norman Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Carola Suárez-Orozco, Director of the Immigration Initiative at Harvard University, and Julia Preston of the Marshall Project. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Josh, thanks. We are a nation of immigrants, we like to say, except for the Native Americans among us. We all have roots in a journey from somewhere else, and an active redefinition of who we would become. It hasn't always been a storybook tale worthy of Emma Lazarus's poem of greeting at the Statue of Liberty. African Americans were brought here against their will. People who came here voluntarily in search of survival or prosperity or liberty often encountered nativist discrimination. For decades, it was illegal for people from China to live in the US. But most who came here stayed and forged a national identity that continues to evolve. Politically, immigration divides us and paralyzes us, it seems. The federal government can't agree on ways to fix a broken system, and the country is divided over a border wall to keep migrants out. In the States, the Republican governor of Texas threatens to deprive undocumented children of public education, while the Democratic governor of California speaks of extending public health insurance coverage to all undocumented immigrants in his state. Is any kind of comprehensive immigration reform conceivable? And if not, where are we headed? And what's the status of immigration to the US in 2022? Well, to address those questions, we have assembled a highly qualified panel. I'll interview each panelist, and then we'll throw it open to discussion and questions and answers. And you can participate by submitting questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We start with Doris Meissner, who is a senior fellow and director of U.S. Immigration Policy of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. The Institute describes itself as a nonpartisan, independent think tank that seeks to improve immigration and integration policies through authoritative research and analysis, opportunities for learning and dialogue, and the development of new ideas to address complex policy questions in ways that benefit all elements of society. From 1993 to 2000, Doris Meissner was Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. That was the old agency that enforced U.S. immigration law when that was part of the purview of the U.S. Department of Justice. That was during the Clinton administration. She had risen to the #3 position at INS during the Reagan administration. And to say that she is knowledgeable about U.S. immigration is a supreme understatement. Doris Meissner, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Very nice to see you, Robert.
And I wonder if first you can give us a snapshot, maybe it's more than a snapshot, but of immigration today. How many people are coming in through legal channels? How many undocumented immigrants live in the country? Where are they? Where do they come from?
Well, of course, we always hear about and talk about illegal immigration and people that are coming that don't have a legal status, but I'm glad you started with what's the overall picture, because we continue through our legal immigration system to bring about 1 million people a year to the United States. That number went down a little bit during the pandemic because of the shutdown of visa issuances and so forth, but we run about 1 million immigrants per year legally. About 2/3 of them are have family members in the United States. Our legal immigration is fundamentally a family reunification pathway to the country, but it also does include, until quite recently, significant numbers of refugees every year and people who come for labor market employment-based reasons. But primarily, family immigration dominates it, which has real implications for what our needs are today, because our needs are both for family reunification. That's a bedrock principle for immigration, but we also need to have more balance in the other areas of immigration, or at least I argue that we would. But at the same time, we have substantial illegal immigration. And that, of course, is what grabs the headlines, and that is what tends to be far more controversial and is the image of immigration often in the public mind. That is primarily across the southwest border. That's what's most well known, but we have significant illegal immigration that resides also in people that come with visas as visitors or other categories of temporary legal immigration and then overstay those visas. And that tends not to be talked about as much and not recognized as much. I think, you put it very well in the introduction that immigration, although we're a nation of immigrants, has been controversial throughout our history. And it has included certainly some of the best elements of who we are as a country, but also some of our very darkest chapters of what we are as a country. And we certainly are seeing some of the dark elements of it in recent years. Largely, the immigration is defined these days as people that are coming, without a legal status, and people are, as immigrants now, are settling all over the United States. This is no longer an issue that affects just the big traditional destination areas, which for the United States have always been New York, Florida, Texas, Chicago, California. We now have large foreign-born populations in many places in the country, Tennessee, Nebraska, Kansas, and it's more controversial there because it's more recent. It's more a concentration of people from countries that look different from the Northern European immigrants that were our history prior to the Second World War. And I think it's fair to say that throughout all of this history and throughout the controversy, certainly since the Second World War, there's generally been agreement at the very high political level that immigration is overall a good thing for the country. We may disagree on whether we should have people come as temporary workers. We may disagree about the numbers, but overall it's been seen as a net plus until recent years. Mm-hmm. In recent years, in the teens, and particularly underscored in the last administration, immigration has been, the narrative and the depiction of immigration has been one of immigrants as a threat to our security, to our economy, to the well-being of American workers. And that is hardening, and it's hardening and making it more difficult for the Congress to do what must be done, which is that our laws are completely out of sync with changing realities on the ground.
Well, is one aspect of that hardening, I suppose, is that the principle that you referred to as family unification, I believe now is assailed as chain migration.
Yes, that's another term for it.
That's considered a negative by critics of it. You said there should be more balance. Who isn't coming into the country because relatives of people who are already migrated here are coming into the country?
Well, and I want to be very clear, the idea of family unification as a bedrock principle is extremely important. There are so many positive attributes to that, both in values and in practical terms. But at the same time, just take now, I mean, it's very clear that we, as an aging society, have labor market needs. Immigration is our source of growth in the population, very important in terms of productivity and our economy, as well as our competitive edge around the world. And we simply don't have the visa availability of visas under our immigration laws to be flexible in meeting labor market needs. Now, that's not to say that labor market needs should be met entirely by immigrants, but immigrants do play a part, and we're simply not in a position statutorily to be able to respond to that. The call, of course, always is the president, the executive branch should do more, and the executive branch, of course, has been increasingly active, particularly in the last 10 to 20 years where immigration is concerned, but that has been very destabilizing for the immigration system. We really need laws that only Congress can adjust in order to have a more responsive immigration system.
I just want you to bring us up to date on one program, which was President Obama's DACA program that addressed the situation of the dreamers, so-called, the people who've been brought here as kids. The idea was they didn't hire a smuggler, they didn't overstay a visa. Their parents brought them here. They've grown up in the United States. They're American in every way except their passport status. What's the status of the DACA protected young people today?
Well, this is the day to ask about it, because today, June 15th, is the 10th anniversary of the DACA program, which, as you say, was created by President Obama, probably represents the outer edge of what can be done by executive action. It has remained in place, even though it has been challenged in the courts. But there's a great example of a group of immigrants, as you've described them, about 800,000 young people, who by all of the research and evidence are doing very well, are net plus contributors to the country. The fact that they have the ability to have legally work in the US and are protected from deportation, which is by no means full legal status at all, but some degree of legal status, makes it possible for them to function and to contribute. But they've been 10 years in that status. Some of them are now approaching the age of 40, have homes, have children, continue their education, and they face a completely uncertain future that's getting more uncertain because of a case that's going to the Supreme Court. That is, in my opinion, just indefensible. These are reality. That's what I mean by realities on the ground, where our laws are simply unable to respond effectively.
Well, Doris Meissner, hang around for the Q&A discussion portion of our panel later. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And we turn now to our next panelist, who is political scientist Norm Ornstein. Norman Ornstein is an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. It's a Washington think tank. For decades, Norm Ornstein studied and explained how Congress works. In recent years, he has spent more time studying and explaining how Congress doesn't work. His books with his longtime collaborator, Tom Mann, include The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track, Also, it's even worse than it looks, how the American constitutional system collided with the new politics of extremism. And with Tom Mann and E.J. Dionne, the book, One Nation After Trump, A Guide for the Perplexed, the Disillusioned, the Desperate, and the Not Yet Deported. Norm Ornstein, welcome back. It's good to talk with you.
Great to be with you, Robert.
In our politics, there are some divisions of which it said there actually is broad agreement throughout a broad middle, but the activists on either end disagree. The party bases disagree, and so the government doesn't reach agreement politically. Is that true of immigration? Is there some belief in immigration similar to what Doris Meissner described as the people on top of the government? Something broadly held in common, despite activists, or are we really deeply divided about immigration?
We're more divided than we should be, Robert, but there's a real difference now in our politics, say, compared to what it was 20 or 30 years ago, where you had an elite consensus, at least a significant enough elite consensus, that people in both parties in Congress could work together and do some immigration reform. Now, the more extreme elements make it almost impossible to do so. And that's been building for some time. I mean, I go back, for example, to when the former Senator Alan Simpson and former Republican, former Representative Ron Mazzoli of Kentucky, a Democrat, did an immigration reform that was widely hailed. Then we had the moment, of course, in the Obama years when we had the two parties come together in the Senate for a broad-based immigration reform proposal. And the House, driven by the more extreme elements, refused to even take it up. Now, I think it's gotten even tougher to do something. Doris mentioned the Supreme Court, which could be an even more divisive force. But just to tell you where we are, one element today, as these hearings of the January 6th committee are going on, to anybody watching Fox News, the biggest story has been the caravan, that group of terrible people marching towards the southern border to invade the United States. That's something that we've seen evoked many, many times. We see now many members of Congress joining with some of the commentators as a diversion, but they're doing it in part because they know that that diversion will work with a substantial share of their constituents and their audience. And that, which is the sort of thing that often comes up whenever you have populism, we get a nativism, we don't want our borders invaded, has been more enduring, even when in the past, when populism recedes because the economy has tended to get a little bit better. When our economy was booming, it was still there. It's still there now.
The extreme version of nativism would be a belief in replacement theory, not just a sense that immigrants are making the country less, initially less Protestant, less white, whatever, but that immigration advocates are trying to do that purposefully in order to outvote whites and relegate them to secondary status. Do you think that at least remains a fringe idea, or does it have traction within conservative circles?
I wish I could say it was a fringe idea, but it's not anymore. And you know, one of the things that's happened in recent decades, and partly it's because of tribal media and social media, is that ideas that people didn't talk about openly because you'd be shamed for it are now talked about openly and often embraced more openly. And that's certainly one of the major streams here. And let's face it, that one of the low moments that we've had in recent years was when we had that terrible riot in Charlottesville, Virginia, people marching in the streets, shouting at that point, Jews will not replace us, but that's all part and parcel of this larger element. And then President Trump at the time saying there were very fine people on both sides. The replacement theory now openly discussed almost on a daily basis by Tucker Carlson in his very popular television show. But let's face it, that's not the only element here that's contributing to these divisions. One of the most interesting things that we've seen is that within the Hispanic community, the larger Hispanic community, which is a variegated community, it's not all one, But we saw, for example, in the votes in 2020 in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, a very strongly Hispanic area, that went for Donald Trump, because there we have a group of people who do not consider themselves brown. They consider themselves white. They've been in the country for 150 years and don't have much use for people coming in over the border who did not have that kind of background. And let me just say, that's nothing new either. I remember, of course, reading vividly about how the German Jews in the East who had come in as immigrants were not at all happy about those coming from Eastern Europe. We saw the same thing with the immigrants coming from Germany, from Italy, from Ireland. It's not a new phenomenon, but it's more widespread and more deadly now than I think we've seen it in our lifetimes, at least.
I just want to put one other point here now, which is the economics of all this. I mean, one could say that Donald Trump seized upon two U.S. policies, one immigration or policies and practices, the other trade, both of which linked American employers with cheap labor, whether it's in our own country or overseas. It was a very potent and effective political combination for Trump as a candidate. And it happened to be coming at a time of deindustrialization of the upper Midwest and other parts of the U.S. Can one look at the issue of immigration as essentially an economic one, or ultimately do you think this is a cultural matter?
Certainly, it's got its roots in economics. And whenever we have high unemployment, we'll get that populist move. Of course, now we have the lowest unemployment in many decades, and we're still seeing it. And that tells you it's not just about economics. I think we have much stronger cultural and even racist elements to the immigration debate now that have always been there, but are more on the surface and more palpable at the moment. And that's a very tricky thing for the society to deal with. You know, in a lot of the economic debates that we've had in the past, and that includes the seasonal workers coming in, a recognition that many jobs are simply not going to be filled except by immigrants coming in, but it was let them come in, do the cheap labor and the backbreaking labor, and then we can send them back. There are ways in which employers have tried to exploit this issue, and they continue to try to exploit this issue. And every time we do an immigration reform that tries to put some burden on employers to regulate their system, you get a lot of pushback from those employers. And we're seeing, of course, all of that play out again now.
Norm Ornstein, thank you. And stick around for the second part of our panel. Our next panelist is Julia Preston, who writes about immigration for the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit news organization that covers criminal justice and immigration. She used to work for the New York Times, where she covered immigration for 10 years. She was also a Times reporter in Mexico and shared in the paper's Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of drug trade corruption in that country. Before that, she wrote for the Washington Post and covered the wars in Central America. She represents the very best in American journalism, and we're very happy to have you as a panelist, Julia. Hi.
Hi, Robert. Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. At the beginning of the Trump administration, you wrote an article that posed the question, can Biden undo Trump policies on immigration? And the article wasn't all that hopeful that he could. We're now almost a year and a half into the Biden administration. So far, what's the answer?
The answer is that Biden has been incredibly active undoing Trump policies and advancing some of his own policies, but his successes have been less visible than his setbacks. And in particular, you can summarize part of Biden's problem because he has faced a bulwark of opposition in the federal courts from Trump-appointed judges who are across the country and have stymied Biden's efforts on a number of highly visible policies. But you could start by pointing to some of the things that he has done. And Doris's shop has done some really useful research about this. At last count, he was up to more than 300 executive actions. And Biden has reversed the travel bans that President Trump put in place that were known in some quarters as the Muslim ban. A very important thing that Biden did was to revamp his enforcement priorities for the actions of immigration agents inside the country, and tried to focus the action of immigration enforcement on terrorists, serious criminals, and people coming recently across the border, and to shift the enforcement action away from families and people who were working. Biden ended the practice of those massive worksite raids that you saw under the Trump administration. Unfortunately, or from my perspective, just in recent days, it's another case where a federal judge has intervened to hold up that policy, that enforcement policy. Another area where Biden has been remarkably active is in the area of temporary status, particularly temporary protected status, which he has extended to Venezuelans, to Haitians. This is a protection that's available to people who are already in the country but don't have a regular status. And giving credit where credit is due, I think Doris's MPI estimated that more than 1 million immigrants have benefited from some new form of protection, of this temporary protection under Biden. So, but you don't ever hear about that, or outside of the immigration world, these things have an enormous impact in the immigrant community. But what you do hear about are some of the setbacks, which have mainly come in terms of Biden's border enforcement and his effort to restore some form of access for asylum seekers at the border. And he has been stymied by the courts on that, and also has been in the face of a probably historic mass migration that's taking place in the hemisphere, also ambivalent and a little reluctant to get rid of some of the brakes that the Trump administration put on the border.
Judy, I just want you to talk a little bit about a story you did about the pandemic and immigrants. You went to New Bedford, Massachusetts, which in the 19th century was famous whaling port. I learned from you now that it's today the scallop capital of America, big seafood and a huge seaport, big commercial fishing port. And Central American migrants are absolutely vital to the functioning of the seafood industry. Yes?
Yes, indeed. And this is, part of my purpose in writing this story was to really, I'm on a tear to try and get the country to start separating the issues involving immigrants who are out of status in the interior of the country from the whole debate about the border. Mm-hmm. We don't have an immigration debate about many of our immigrants who are out of status in the country. We have a civil rights debate. And I think this was, vividly illustrated by the situation in New Bedford, where you have these Guatemalan Mayan immigrants who have been there for a period of time. A lot of them have US citizen kids, and they are absolutely essential to keeping that seafood industry going in New Bedford. They are the workers who are in the processing plants, cleaning the fish and cleaning the scallops and the shrimp and making it edible for American tables. And they continued to do that. Those workers are manufacturing workers, and they are subject to the same paycheck deductions as other manufacturing workers. And yet they were not eligible for unemployment insurance during the pandemic. In many cases, as soon as they were able to go back to work, they had to go back to work, regardless of what the health risks were. And an interesting thing that happened that we saw in New Bedford that I think is, I'm also on a tear to try and bring this forward, is that because those folks have paycheck deductions, they are taxpayers. they're filing their taxes. So we're talking about a community of immigrants who are parents of American citizen kids. They are paying their taxes, they're filing their taxes, and they are going to work when nobody else in New Bedford was ready to go to work during the pandemic. And there are ways and opportunities through the tax system that we can recognize those families, recognize the fact that they have many, many American citizen kids. I'm looking at the figures. It's almost 7 million children who are American citizens in the country who have some person in their family who's a breadwinner, who's an undocumented person.
Mm-hmm.
You have almost 5 million what we call mixed status families. So I'm encouraging people to think of this as the new horizon of our immigration discussion. We need to start talking about how we're going to bring these kids forward, how we're going to bring these families forward, and just recognize their basic role in our economy and our communities.
And the role that you describe of Central American migrants in the scallop business in New Bedford could have been Central American workers in the chicken processing plants of the Delmarva Peninsula on the Atlantic shore. They could have been people working in meatpacking plants in the West. It's a very common role to be, and they were stuck being both essential employees and yet still living in this shadow world. That,
in many cases during the pandemic, the Trump administration actually they required these essential workers to keep working, and so and yet they, if they were sick or if there was some problem with the workplace itself, they're not eligible for unemployment insurance. We did a calculation. The income differential for these workers who were not eligible for much of the pandemic relief, it was $50,000 for these families over the course of the pandemic. It was just as, it was more. They missed out on more income than they make in a regular year because they were excluded from aid during the pandemic.
Julia, Preston, thank you. Stay with us. We'll be back to you in a few minutes after we hear from our fourth panelist, who is Carola Suárez-Orozco, who's director of the Immigration Initiative at Harvard University. She's especially interested in immigrant origin children, essentially children with an immigrant parent. Who are they? How are they affected by government policies and practices? Dr. Suárez-Orozco is a psychologist by training, and I'm happy to say that she is our next panelist. Hi, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to join you all.
I'd like to start by quoting something from the website of a project that you founded a few years ago. It's two statements, actually. The first is a measure of how important immigrant origin children are. The second statement demands some explanation. The Reimagining Migration Project website tells us children of immigrants are 27% of school-aged youth in the United States. Next sentence, they are mostly invisible and often misunderstood. How are they mostly invisible and often misunderstood?
Well, they are within the education system. They are usually classified as English learners, which is comprises some of their experience, but certainly not all. Many are English learners, but some are not. And I would argue that it doesn't in any way capture the complexities of their experience. It certainly doesn't capture what I'm so glad Julia alluded to, the issue of being a mixed status child, of being a citizen of our country and therefore entitled to all the rights and benefits of citizenship, and yet having a parent who not only can be deported at any moment, which leaves them with this chronic sense of insecurity, but also is not accessing the benefits that they should be able to access. It doesn't, the English learner category doesn't talk about acculturative issues. It doesn't address racialization and xenophobia, which is very much part of their experience. So it's an incomplete view of how they are, adjusting to the new land.
And completely inapplicable to West Indian or South Asian often, or West African immigration for
example.
The idea of being being non-English.
So English learner is it's a convenient category for schools, but it doesn't begin to address the complexity of their experience, and therefore we're not utilizing it in our immigration debate enough. Julia, I'm so glad you're trumpeting that. I've been trying to say this for many years, and secondly, it doesn't address when schools are not really taking a whole child approach as they try to serve these kids.
Is it any different from the experience of Americans for centuries? I mean, my parents, who were children of immigrants when they came to the U.S. and learned their English at school. I mean, is there something different because there is a negative attitude toward immigrants abroad, or because the threat of deportation looms so large? What is the?
Well, I think there are. If you look at the historical dimension, in some ways, everything it's very much the same, and in some ways, it's quite different. So, learning a new language, the kids always learn the new language. They may not get to the highest level of academic English quickly if they're not attending the best educational system, but they will. Kids, the first generation always learn. The second generation always learns the new language. And there's always issues of acculturative stresses, the parents holding on to old ways, the kids wanting to become like their peers, and there's those tensions. Nothing's changed in that dimension. And in some ways, xenophobia is not new, right? Irish need not apply was, something that, and, anti-Semitism, God knows, has been a continuing thread. However, I would say it's been hyper intensified in the recent decades. And it's become a political lightning rod. I mean, I just to give you a quick example, I wrote an op-ed about Abbott, trying to get rid of the Bleier versus Doe case, and within 15 minutes, hate emails were coming in. It's that much of a lightning kind of topic. So. I think it's intensified, and and there's been a systematic under the previous administration. There were nearly, I think MPI said there were nearly 400 laws that were changed along the way to make our immigration system is now as convoluted as our tax code. So when folks say get in line, there is no line that most people can figure out, especially if you are from specific countries and try to fit in particular categories.
Of the 27% of school-age youth in the country who are children of immigrants, how many would qualify as members of non-white minority groups?
About 85%.
The overwhelming majority.
The overwhelming majority, that's right. Because most of those come from Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa. Now, Latine, Hispanic folk are complicated because a lot of them don't consider themselves anything other than white, but they're actually not necessarily treated as white. So, but that's another conversation.
I want to know, let's assume we understand why people want to be immigrants to the United States, that it should be self-evident. Why do we want to have immigrants? Why is it important to those of us who are already here that there be new immigrants coming to the United States?
Well, I'll answer that quickly, and then I want to say one point and one other point. So why, immigrants have been they are a source of creativity, energy, doing the hard work that Julia points to that other folks who've been here longer don't necessarily want, but they bring a kind of creativity and energy that we know is in many ways has been the DNA of the U.S. Right? Why are we such an innovative nation? It's because of our immigrant roots and the kind of continually feeding that. So I would say that that's the main reason. I think family reunification, there's as children, as families, certain members are in, their kids are left behind, it just makes sense from the humanistic point of view to bring them in. And you know, but I want to make the point, even if we were to all of a sudden have a wave a magic wand and figure out how to fix the immigration system, and then fix it and then close the borders and not let anybody else in. I'm not advocating that, but even if we could do that, you know, 80, we have a huge percentage of kids who are the children of immigrants, and they're here and they're part of our society, 27% of our kids. And we're not doing a very good job of figuring out how to, you know, to help them feel like they are members of our society with our active exclusionary narrative that is, you know, every day they have to encounter. And so I worry about that as well. So even beyond the actual policies, just these social attitudes are deeply troublesome and worrisome. Because if you feel excluded, how do you begin to try to belong?
Well, Carola Suárez-Orozco, I want you to stay right where you are, and I want our other panelists to come back, Doris Meissner, Julia Preston, Norm Ornstein, and I want to put some questions to you. First, I'm just curious whether, starting with Doris, who went first, whether there are things you've heard from your fellow panelists that you wanted to briefly underscore. Everyone's citing your data here. It's your
go-to place.
Absolutely.
Well, good. I'm glad. I'm very happy to hear that. I'd say a couple of things on this question that you just asked about why would we want immigrants? Yes. Why should we want immigrants? You know, certainly the points that Carola made, I agree with. I would say that, you know, in addition, we are an aging society. Mm-hmm. This is demographically the first time we've been in this position in our time in history. And, you know, we can either continue to be a country of immigration and grow and be productive and remain competitive, or we can go the way of Japan. I mean, that's really the fork in the road, and in other words, a dying society that is older and ultimately not going to be able to compete. And that's all about immigration. So, you know, one doesn't have to have any particular sentimentality about it. It's a strong self-interest that immigration serves. You know, in addition to that, the diversity of our immigration today, and, you know, as Carola said, our immigration is almost entirely Asian and Latin American now. And now Asian immigration outpaces immigration from Latin America, which is a recent phenomenon. And also, and in addition to that, if you look at educational levels, we certainly have immigrants coming that are lesser skilled, but more and more immigrants, particularly legal immigrants, come with higher education. Mm-hmm. And are more educated than native born Americans. So that infusion of technical and human capital is very, very much in our interest. It is, I think, an economic issue, but, you know, to what it is that you were talking about with Norm earlier, deeper than the economic issue, because I've made these arguments again and again. We all have. They can be made. They don't go to people's gut. What goes to people's gut is the cultural issue. Yeah. And it is the issue of change. It is the issue of rapid change. Immigration is far more controversial in places where the change has been just 3 to 5% of the makeup of the places like Tennessee, for instance, of the population, than it is in places, you know, like New York and Los Angeles, where the change has been in the 20 and 30 percentiles. The contrast with what it is that people grew up with as compared to what it is that we're becoming is the difficulty. And we do not help it with our policies. The impacts of immigration, net, macro, are very good for the country. The effects of immigration and the burdens, and there are burdens that go with immigration, are borne at the local level, particularly in school systems, in healthcare systems, and in law enforcement. And we do not as a country have policies that respond to those differential impacts.
And I guess I should note that certainly if you're a member of the baby boom generation, as I'm, the charter group here, we grew up in a country, we were born into a country which was the product of a couple of decades of very restrictive immigration.
Exactly.
Very little immigration, and nearly all of it came from Northern Europe or from the British Isles and Canada. And so the complexion of America has literally been changing during our lifetimes. Norman,
That's exactly right.
Norm Ornstein, any just remarks on what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
Yeah, and stimulated a little bit as well by what we just heard from Doris. I mean, one other thing that I would add is that most of the immigrants coming into this country are just the kinds of people that one would want. They're here because they want better lives for themselves and their families. They want to fulfill what we have long called the American dream, where they will work hard, including at often very horrible jobs. They believe in democracy. So there are a lot of reasons why they're good forces. Now, following on what Doris said, we need to note that the CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, which really is the kind of driving force of radical right movement, the radical right movement in this country, just held its annual conference in Hungary. Now, normally they get all of the stars of the right, the Ted Cruzes and Tom Cottons of the world. Here they went to honor Viktor Orban, and he's now their hero. And Viktor Orban, not just because he's a strong arm, and not just because what they're doing in Hungary fits a vision of too many in this country, which is having the trappings of a democracy, but a Potemkin village of institutions, elections, except they're rigged, and genuinely rigged, not phonily rigged, a judiciary that seems independent, but that will never do anything that the leader doesn't want, a free press that's only free as long as they stay in line. But a core part of it is Orban is preserving the Hungarian heritage,
Cultural heritage.
which is the cultural heritage, which is what they want. And there's another stream of this, the sort of political stream, which is they want to bring in all these people who ultimately will vote for Democrats. But that's a side issue for them. It is far more that it's polluting that cultural heritage. That's where the replacement theory comes into play. And I think it's an important strain and now becoming a dominant strain, and we have to find ways to fight against it. The second point I would make is finding policies that could actually work in this area are extraordinarily difficult. And even when we had bipartisan agreement, it didn't work. We are a country that is so huge, the borders are porous, and it's not just people coming in over the southern border or even coming in over the northern border. It's people who come here on tourist visas and then stay beyond what they wanted to. Being able to stop illegal immigration requires draconian forces in a society that shouldn't have those draconian forces. So if you look at most of the bills in the past, they kind of have two elements that are supposed to balance each other off. Finding a pathway to citizenship for those who've been here for years, the ones that we've heard so much about, including in New Bedford and other places, while at the same time, we're going to really crack down on illegal immigration. We're going to have cards, we're going to have all the rest of it. And even when we've done it, it just doesn't work very well. It's going to be a problem as long as this country exists, and it's going to be a problem as long as other countries exist. And of course, we're seeing this play out in Europe now, especially, first with all of the immigration from Syria, from the Middle East, from Africa, as radical forces have moved in, now with Ukrainians fleeing their country. This is neither new nor easy to deal with, and it's becoming one of the most dominant features of a breakdown in democratic regimes across the world.
Julia Preston, thoughts on what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
Well, one thing I wanted to say was, for those of us who labor in immigration world, the reason that we still, or at least that I continue to do it, is because we get to deal with immigrants, and there's no opportunity that is too small for an immigrant to take. They see everything as a path forward. And this is true for, I think it's good to remember that this is true for the CEO and founder of Google and you know, so many people in Silicon Valley and in the upper levels of innovation in our economy. And it's also true for the farm worker who comes to you know, pick the strawberries in California. I mean, they are just remarkable in their kind of the whole dynamic is optimism. And so that's one thing I would say. The other antidote to this extremely gloomy federal picture is what's happening in the states. And there has been just a lot of activity at the state levels where there are sympathetic state governments, even in places like Utah. I mean, if you we have an example in Massachusetts that has a huge meaning for the people in New Bedford, which was just last week. The legislature overrode a veto by Charlie Baker, the governor, and granted driver's licenses to people who are out of status. And this is huge. This is the difference between taking your kid to school in the morning, driving your kid to school in the morning and not knowing if you'll be there at night when that child comes home. Now these people can work, they can drive to work, you know, legally, they can get car insurance, they can have title for their own vehicles. So, and across the country, a lot of this is happening. So even though Congress has just abjectly failed to address these issues, there is a lot of dynamism at the state level.
Thank you, Julia. Carola, Suárez-Orozco.
Well, I would like to be optimistic, and I'm basically optimistic by nature. I think all of us here wouldn't be continuing to do this work as many years as we have if we weren't. I think we are facing a serious moment where we have to figure out a way to counter the narrative. The future of a whole group of young people is deeply at risk. And the future, frankly, of our nation is at risk if we don't figure this one out. And for the time being, I agree with Julia. We are doing it state by state. You know, California has figured out a lot of, has really been ahead of the curve in a lot of ways. I live in Massachusetts now. I was shocked to see that undocumented students were being charged out-of-state tuition. Still, when we arrived there, we're working on changing that. So there are hopeful pockets, but ultimately we're going to have to do something at a federal level. In the meantime, we're just chipping away at the edges. But unless we change the minds and hearts of the public, I think it's going to be very difficult to pivot the Congress, which is right now, you know, very much at the heart of this problem.
I just have a couple of questions that I'm going to pose to one or two of you, but Doris Meissner first. When we spoke the other day in preparation for this panel, I reminded you of a dinner that I remember going to in 2001. It was an organized discussion of immigration policy. It's pretty optimistic about the prospects of a big comprehensive immigration reform. George W. Bush was the new president. He was a border state governor who not only didn't regard Mexican Americans as insidious intruders into America, but he ran pretty well among them. He got votes from them in Texas, and there was a lot of sentiment. That was the second weekend, I calculate, in September. A few days later was 9/11. And it seemed to me that there was real punctuation there, that the entire attitude toward immigrants changed in ways that bear no relation to the people who pulled off 9/11. But is that for you, Doris? I mean, is that a punctuation mark in the immigration discussion?
9/11 was an absolute game changer. I mean, it doesn't, you know, we don't have a counterfactual, so we don't know what would, yeah. I don't know that the deal that he and President Fox were imagining actually would have happened, but something would have happened. He was committed. There was we would have gone a different direction. But 9/11 created after all, the hijackers that bombed the World Trade Center came with visas that were legally issued by consulates overseas. So immigration was right at the center of the only attack, on our homeland, we didn't even use the word homeland then, that we've experienced. And it's mushroomed from there, the whole reorganization of the government to create a Department of Homeland Security, to vest the immigration, locate the immigration agencies and all kinds of other orphan pieces of the government into a Department of Homeland Security, redefined immigration as a security issue. Right. And it was not seen or treated as a security issue before 9/11. When I was in the government, anything that you look back at and talk about, Norm talked about the 1986 law, that was all law enforcement, civilian law enforcement, and domestic agencies. Now immigration is national security. And so the Congress then followed suit by pouring billions of dollars. I mean, you've heard me use this before. We spend more money on immigration enforcement than we spend on all other federal criminal law enforcement activities, including the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, ATF. We are spending enormous amounts on immigration enforcement, and it has not given the public confidence in our immigration system. And we have a paradox. The paradox is, if we would enact immigration laws that would make it more possible to come to the United States legally, we would be able to enforce our immigration laws more effectively, because they would be rational and they would line up with what's going on with market forces, really. Norm said we can't really do this. I think we actually can do it. We don't have to be 100% on immigration enforcement. All that we need in immigration is some degree of rationality in the system that gives the public confidence that somebody is minding the store. And that is what we don't have, because the only ways of getting here are largely responding to market forces through illegal entries. And that's just, we're harming ourselves every day.
Let me put a question to, whoever else wants to answer. Thank you, Doris. And that is the question of citizenship. As much of immigration is about getting a job, going somewhere to get a job. And while the best story of American immigration, the one we like to tell, is people who packed their belongings and got on a ship and came across the ocean and stayed, and now their grandchildren are all PhDs or something like that. There were a lot of people who came here, made some money, went back to Italy, had the gold watch, and retired somewhat prosperously, thanks to their stay in the United States. I read in a study of remigration, it was called, that Polish migrants to the U.S., when Poland returned to the map of Europe after World War I, a huge chunk of Poles went back and left. So we think in terms of the importance of citizenship and a permanent relationship with the U.S., but at the same time, many migrants have a much more transactional relationship with the U.S. How central is the idea that there must be a pathway to citizenship, as opposed to guarantees that you can have a job and not be thrown out of the country next week? Who wants to take that?
I think that's a great question. And again, looking at the historical record, I think that's absolutely right. If you talk to immigrants, a lot of them say they want to work long enough to earn enough money to do Ecky's thing and then go back. The realities on the ground is, once they have children and they have grandchildren, plans change, and then they often want to stay over the course of time. But I think you'd find a substantial amount that, if they had 5-year visas that were renewable, where they could be recognized, many of them would go back. So just having, I agree entirely with Doris, having pathways, legalized pathways, but not necessarily to citizenship, would do wonders for the human beings on the ground who are caught in this web of crazy laws, dysfunctional laws, as well as for building the confidence of the public once they saw that illegal pathways were not always happening.
So you're saying perhaps the guaranteed pathway to citizenship might be it might be an obstacle to progress here.
Yeah, so shorter term visas that are renewable might really be a sensible solution.
I mean, I think you have to do both. Citizenship is extremely important in our system and for a democracy. But where the idea of a pathway to citizenship really runs into trouble is for the current unauthorized population. And that's 11 million people, and that's 1 in every foreign-born person in our country. And they are in a limbo status, and we cannot break the logjam of the majority of Congress is not going to grant that. And so I, for one, do believe that where the 11 million unauthorized are concerned, if we could simply get so far as what the DACA status has been, in other words, a work authorization and a no fear of deportation, unless of course you commit criminal acts, that most people who are here in an unauthorized status would just welcome that and be fine. And the reason underlying why that won't hurt us as a country is because we have birthright citizenship. In other words, this would only be a one-generational phenomenon. The concern always is for a democracy that you build in a second-class status that perpetuates. But that's not the United States. If you're born here, you're a citizen, and that saves us in terms of the idea of democracy and participation over the long term.
I'm going to just put for the last word here a question to Norm Ornstein, short answer question. What are the chances of there being immigration legislation anytime soon?
0. We're simply not going to see it. One thing that could happen is if somehow lightning struck and we got a returning Democratic majority in the House and a somewhat larger Democratic majority in the Senate, then we might see something happening. But we also have to keep in mind, Robert, that we might have a Supreme Court, a radical Supreme Court right now that might make it even harder to do any kind of reasonable actions through executive action.
Right.
And that may put us on a worse path. And finally, one point that we haven't mentioned, which is we always had this debate of people saying we want to cut out illegal immigration, but we love legal immigration. We have a substantial political force now that wants to cut dramatically back or even end legal immigration to the country. It's not a great place to be.
Not very encouraging, but thank you just the same. With apologies for a very bumpy technical start, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Julia Preston, Doris Meissner, Carola Suárez-Orozco, and as we just heard, Norm Ornstein. Also, many thanks to Joshua Plout, Nate Bonzani, Ronnie Giuliano, and Adrian Kiss from American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and also our technical director, Sam Lunetta. Our program sponsor, as I said, is American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization representing in the United States Israel's largest hospital, the Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva, Greater Tel Aviv. The website of the American Friends is www.afrmc.org. Join us next month for What is the Future of Our Energy Supply? With guests Jason Bordoff, the founding dean of Columbia Climate School, Deborah Gordon of Brown University, and Matthew Hudson of the New Yorker. I'm Robert Siegel, and this is Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. I'll see you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.